For nearly 40 years, buying a new laptop from any major manufacturer meant one thing without exception. Windows was already inside the box, whether you wanted it or not, with the cost quietly baked into the price tag. That default has just cracked, and it cracked at the very top of the industry. As of 2026, Lenovo, the single largest PC manufacturer on the planet by shipment volume, is now selling ThinkPad laptops in the US and Canada with Ubuntu or Fedora Linux pre-installed instead of Windows at prices up to $140 cheaper than the identical Windows model, same hardware, same ThinkPad X1 carbon chassis, just a different operating system, and a noticeably smaller invoice. HP ran an extensive internal Linux trial throughout 2025. Dell and Asus have both been offering Linux builds as an alternative option, with reporting suggesting both companies are actively considering making that the default rather than the exception. So today, we're digging into exactly why the biggest names in the PC industry are quietly stepping away from decades of Windows exclusivity, what's actually driving it, and what it means for the laptop you're probably using to watch this video right now. Let's start with the number that explains why this is happening at all. Because it's not ideology, and it's not really even a Linux success story on its own merits. It's math. Every Windows laptop sold has historically included a Microsoft licensing fee baked directly into the manufacturing cost, typically adding somewhere between $80 and $150 per unit, invisible to the buyer as a separate line item, but very much visible on the manufacturer's own balance sheet across millions of units a year. Strip that license out, and the savings compound fast at scale. Lenovo's own Linux ThinkPad pricing makes that gap directly visible to consumers for the first time in years, rather than burying it inside a bundled retail price the way it's always been done before. For IT departments planning hardware refreshes in 2026, that's not a rounding error. Across a fleet of a few thousand machines, that per unit saving turns into a genuinely serious line item on a company's annual budget. And the timing here is not a coincidence. It's tied directly to a deadline that already forced the industry's hand. Microsoft officially ended all support for Windows 10 on October 14th, 2025, which meant every business running fleets of Windows 10 machines suddenly faced a hard choice: upgrade to Windows 11 across their entire hardware inventory, or replace machines that didn't meet Windows 11's stricter requirements, chiefly the mandatory TPM 2.0 security chip. That deadline created what analysts are now openly calling a forced hardware refresh cycle across the entire business PC market, and a forced refresh cycle is exactly the moment IT decision makers stop simply reordering whatever they bought last time and start actually asking whether Windows is even necessary for what their organization does. For a huge number of businesses running primarily web-based tools, cloud applications, and browser-first workflows, the honest technical answer increasingly coming back is no, it isn't. That question matters even more once you notice who's actually driving this shift beyond the big three manufacturers. Companies like System76 and Framework have spent recent years building laptops specifically designed around Linux as the primary operating system, not an afterthought bolted onto a Windows-first design. That's meaningfully different from Linux support that exists because enthusiasts demanded it after the fact. These are companies engineering hardware where Linux compatibility is the starting assumption, not a retrofit. And the broader developer community has been moving in the same direction for reasons that go well beyond a licensing fee. Community. Writing throughout early 2026 has repeatedly pointed to Windows 11's aggressive AI integration and data collection practices as a genuine catalyst, not just a minor annoyance. Windows 11 has been documented collecting an unusually broad range of user data, spanning hardware specifications, app usage patterns, and browsing behavior, all in service of features like Copilot that a growing number of technically sophisticated users say they never asked for and can't fully remove. One recent Windows convert, quoted in developer community writing earlier this year, summarized the feeling bluntly. It feels like Copilot is always watching you. That's not a fringe complaint anymore. It's become one of the most consistently cited reasons technical users give for actually following through on a switch they might have only casually considered a few years earlier. So here's where this actually leaves the market heading into the back half of 2026. Linux desktop market share reached roughly 4.7% globally by the end of 2025, up from just 2.76% in July 2022, a genuine 70% increase in under 4 years, and the United States crossed the 5% threshold for the first time in June 2025. Those numbers still leave Windows firmly dominant, holding well over half of global desktop usage even after this shift, but dominance and inevitability are two very different things. And for the first time in decades, the world's largest PC manufacturers themselves are the ones actively building the exit ramp, rather than reluctantly tolerating it as a niche request buried in a customer suggestion box. Let's go deeper into what HP actually did in 2025 because a trial sounds vague until you see the specifics. And the specifics are exactly what should worry Microsoft. HP, the world's second largest PC manufacturer, ran an extensive internal trial throughout 2025, testing Linux as the default operating system on select laptop lines, with Windows repositioned as an optional, additional cost upgrade rather than the automatic starting point. The internal reasoning behind that test lines up almost exactly with what Lenovo has since made public with its own Linux ThinkPads. Lower per unit licensing costs, reduced hardware requirements, since Linux doesn't demand the same TPM security chip and processor generation Windows 11 enforces, and, this is the detail that tends to surprise people, measurably fewer customer support calls. Lower support call volume sounds like a small operational detail, but at the scale a company like HP or Lenovo ships hardware, every reduced support ticket is real, compounding savings across millions of units a year, on top of whatever they're already saving on the Windows license itself. Dell's relationship with Linux actually goes back further than most people realize, and it's worth understanding that history to see why 2026 feels different rather than just more of the same. Dell has offered Linux-based systems in narrow, specialized product lines for years, including high-end workstations built specifically for industries like oil and gas exploration, where Linux's stability and specific software compatibility mattered more than mainstream consumer familiarity. What's changed by 2026 is scope. Reporting this year suggests Dell, alongside Asus, is now actively evaluating whether to expand Linux availability well beyond those narrow specialist categories and into its mainstream consumer and business laptop lineups. The exact same kind of shift Lenovo has already made concrete and public with its ThinkPad pricing. And this shift isn't confined to laptops sitting on store shelves, waiting for individual consumers to choose between two boxes. The institutional side of this story, which gets far less attention but arguably carries more long-term weight, has been building steadily through 2025 and into 2026. European governments have continued accelerating migration away from Microsoft dependency, driven by a mix of data sovereignty concerns, rising long-term licensing costs, and a growing institutional view that heavy reliance on a single vendor is itself a strategic liability worth eliminating, regardless of how reliable that vendor's software actually is. Germany's public sector has continued pushing Linux adoption, with renewed momentum specifically around the Windows 10 deadline, and France's Gendarmerie, which completed its own Linux migration years earlier, has become the reference case other government bodies now cite directly when building their own business. Justification for making the same move: when a police force running critical national infrastructure has already proven a full Linux transition works at scale, that case study carries real weight in boardrooms far beyond France's own borders. Schools and universities are following a parallel, if less dramatic, path. Educational institutions hit by the exact same Windows 11 hardware wall as everyday households have been evaluating Linux and Chromebook alternatives in growing numbers through 2025 and 2026, numbers that would have looked like a fringe experiment just 5 years earlier. And that brings up a piece of this story that deserves its own mention, because Google has been quietly building its own answer to this exact moment. Reporting from CES 2026 and throughout the year has detailed Google's development of what's being called Aluminum OS, an Android-based operating system positioned as the eventual successor to ChromeOS on desktop and laptop hardware. Android-powered desktop PCs built around this new operating system are being described by multiple outlets covering the space as a serious, imminent category rather than a distant experiment, potentially giving budget-conscious consumers and schools an entirely separate non-Windows option beyond traditional Linux distributions altogether. Gaming deserves its own mention here too, because it was, for the longest time, the single strongest argument keeping people locked into Windows regardless of everything else. That argument has been steadily eroding. Valve's Steam hardware survey recorded Linux gaming hitting an all-time high of 5.33% of active users in March 2026, driven directly by Valve's own Proton compatibility layer and by the cultural normalization the Steam Deck created, a genuinely mainstream gaming device that runs a Linux-based operating system by default and is sold in numbers large enough to shift how an entire generation of gamers thinks about what Linux can and can't do. A teenager who spent years gaming on a Steam Deck simply doesn't carry the same skepticism about Linux gaming performance that someone who fought driver compatibility issues a decade ago still does, and that generational shift happened with essentially no dedicated marketing campaign at all. Just a product that consistently worked well enough to earn trust through use rather than advertising. So, put all of these threads together, and a clear pattern starts to emerge across 2025 and 2026 that goes well beyond any single manufacturer's decision. The world's largest PC company by volume is now selling Linux machines at a discount, directly undercutting its own Windows pricing. The second largest ran a serious internal trial testing the same approach. Purpose-built. Linux hardware manufacturers are growing steadily rather than staying a permanent niche. Governments and schools are treating vendor independence as a real strategic priority rather than a theoretical one. And Google is quietly building an entirely separate non-Windows ecosystem aimed at exactly the budget and education market segments most vulnerable to Windows 11s. Stricter hardware requirements. None of these forces on their own would be a major story. Together, in the same 18-month window, they start to look like the beginning of something the PC industry hasn't seriously experienced in 3 decades. Genuine structural diversification away from a single default operating system. Here's the detail that actually explains why Microsoft can't simply ignore this shift the way it might have a decade ago. The company itself may be about to hand PC manufacturers and IT departments an even bigger reason to keep exploring alternatives. Reporting through 2026 has detailed Microsoft's plans, expected to be fully outlined at its Build conference, around a next-generation Windows built with subscription-based licensing, tiers as a central part of its business model going forward, alongside deeper cloud integration and expanded AI capabilities. For decades, Windows worked the way most people still assume it works. You bought a device, the license came baked into the price, and updates simply arrived as part of owning the machine. A shift toward subscription-style licensing, even a partial one aimed initially at enterprise tiers, changes that entire calculation for exactly the IT departments already running the numbers on Lenovo's discounted Linux ThinkPads. And it's not just an internal Microsoft decision happening in isolation. Outlets covering this shift have explicitly noted that competitors like Google Workspace and Amazon Workspaces already offer cloud-native alternatives, and that open-source desktop Linux is likely to get, in the words of one report, a fresh look from cost-conscious organizations specifically because of this pricing shift. To understand why this moment feels different from every previous prediction of a Windows alternative breaking through, it actually helps to look at why none of the earlier attempts ever stuck. Historical reporting on Microsoft's relationship with PC manufacturers lays out exactly how this worked for decades. Alternative operating systems, whether Linux, IBM's OS/2, or BOS back in the 1990s, always asked manufacturers to take on real extra work. Testing hardware compatibility from scratch, preparing separate recovery media, training support staff on a second operating system, writing entirely new documentation, and explaining the difference to retailers and customers who expected Windows by default. On paper, a free or cheaper operating system always looked attractive to a manufacturer's bottom line. In practice, that saving could disappear quickly once returns, extra support calls, and reduced marketing cooperation from Microsoft got factored back in. A PC manufacturer never needed to actually dislike Linux to avoid shipping it. It only needed to conclude correctly that shipping Windows was simply safer for its business at scale, because the entire hardware industry was built around standardization, speed, and predictable support costs, and alternative operating systems introduced friction into all 3 at once. What's different in 2026 is that several of those old frictions have genuinely been resolved, independent of anything Microsoft does or doesn't do. Hardware compatibility, historically the single biggest legitimate criticism of desktop Linux, has reached the point where modern laptops running current Linux distributions handle Wi-Fi, audio, touchpads, and external displays automatically for the overwhelming majority of common configurations, without the manual driver hunting that used to define the experience a decade ago. Gaming compatibility, once an absolute deal breaker, has improved to the point where ProtonDB, the community database tracking game compatibility on Linux through Valve's Proton layer, now reports that over 80% of the top 1,000 Steam games run on Linux with at least a gold compatibility rating, or better as of 2026. That's a genuinely remarkable shift from where Linux gaming stood even 5 years ago, even though competitive titles with aggressive anti-cheat systems and peak performance for demanding graphics workloads still meaningfully favor Windows. And that honesty matters here, because it's worth being fair about where Linux still doesn't fully compete, rather than overselling this trend into something it isn't. Independent testing published in 2026 found Windows still outperforming Linux by a meaningful margin in certain graphically demanding scenarios, with Linux reaching only around 75% of Windows performance at higher resolutions on identical hardware, and Intel's Linux graphics driver maturity specifically lagging behind NVIDIA and AMD, making certain GPU choices a weaker fit for Linux gamers today. For organizations already deeply embedded in Microsoft's ecosystem, running Active Directory, Exchange, and SharePoint as their operational backbone, the actual cost of migrating desktops to Linux while keeping all of that infrastructure running smoothly can outweigh whatever licensing savings show up on paper. But for organizations already living in a cloud-native, browser-first world running tools like Google Workspace, Slack, or web-based enterprise software instead, testing published in 2026 found that Linux desktops with commercial support subscriptions could save an organization running 500 seats over $200,000 across 3 years, while requiring less specialized security overhead than an equivalent Windows deployment. That distinction is exactly why this isn't really a story about Linux winning outright, and framing it that way would honestly oversell what's happening. It's a story about genuine, workload by workload diversification finally becoming realistic at scale for the specific slice of the market where it makes clear financial and practical sense, rather than Linux somehow becoming a universal drop-in replacement overnight. Windows remains, by a wide margin, the correct choice for competitive gamers, for organizations deeply embedded in Microsoft's enterprise stack, and for anyone whose workflow depends on a specific piece of Windows-only software with no viable Linux equivalent. But the number of scenarios where that used to be true by default, simply because there wasn't a serious alternative worth evaluating, has been shrinking steadily and measurably through 2025 and 2026, and the world's largest PC manufacturers are now the ones actively building products around that shrinking gap rather than ignoring it. So let's bring this back to the actual honest question, sitting underneath every headline calling this a Windows exodus. Is Microsoft actually losing the PC industry, or is something more specific and arguably more interesting happening instead? Based on everything the data shows through 2026, it's the second one, and understanding that distinction matters if you want to actually predict where this goes next, rather than just reacting to a dramatic headline. Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of the world's desktop and laptop computers, full stop. Nothing in Lenovo's discounted Linux ThinkPads, HP's internal trial, or Dell and Asus quietly expanding their own Linux options changes that basic fact in 2026. What's actually changed is something narrower, but genuinely significant. For the first time in roughly 3 decades, the biggest manufacturers building the actual hardware are treating Windows as one legitimate option among a small handful, rather than the only serious choice worth putting on a store shelf or a corporate procurement list. That's a meaningful shift in posture, even if the underlying market share numbers are still moving, gradually rather than collapsing overnight. A 4.7% global Linux desktop share, up from 2.76% just 4 years ago, represents a genuine 70% increase in a remarkably short window. But it also means well over 90% of desktop and laptop users worldwide are still running Windows or Mac OS. Anyone telling you Windows is disappearing is exaggerating, just as much as anyone claiming nothing at all has changed. The honest picture sits in between. A slow structural diversification that's compounding year over year, rather than a single dramatic collapse happening in real time. What makes 2026 specifically the year this became impossible to dismiss as a fringe trend comes down to the sheer number of separate independent pressures converging on the exact same 18-month window. Microsoft ending Windows 10 support in October 2025 forced a hardware refresh cycle across the entire business PC market at precisely the same moment Lenovo decided to make its Linux pricing advantage public and visible, rather than quietly buried in enterprise-only contracts. That refresh cycle is colliding with reporting that Microsoft itself may be moving towards subscription-based licensing for its next major Windows release, a shift that would hand every cost-conscious IT department in the world an even stronger incentive to at least evaluate the alternatives sitting right in front of them. Meanwhile, hardware compatibility and gaming performance on Linux have genuinely matured to the point where testing a switch no longer requires the kind of technical expertise it did even 5 years ago, and companies like System76 and Framework have proven there's a sustainable business building laptops around Linux as the default assumption rather than an afterthought. None of these individual pressures would be a major story on their own. A licensing subscription rumor here, a hardware compatibility improvement there, one manufacturer testing a pricing experiment. Any single thread taken in isolation looks like a footnote. But watching all of them converge on the same PC industry in the same roughly 18-month period is genuinely different from anything the industry has experienced since Windows first cemented its dominance decades ago. And it's worth being clear-eyed about what kind of change this actually represents, because it isn't a rebellion, and it isn't ideology driving these decisions at the corporate level. Lenovo isn't shipping cheaper Linux ThinkPads because the company has developed a sudden philosophical preference for open-source software. It's doing it because the math works, because customers are asking for it in growing numbers, and because Windows 10's end-of-life deadline created a natural moment for millions of buyers to actually ask the question in the first place. That's a far more durable kind of pressure than a passing trend, because it's rooted in genuine economics rather than momentary enthusiasm that fades once the headlines move on to something else, So where does that leave Microsoft, and where does it leave you? If you're in the market for a new laptop or planning a business hardware refresh sometime soon. Microsoft's own long-term strength has never really rested on Windows being the only technically viable option. It's rested on Windows being the safest, most predictable, least risky default choice for both manufacturers and buyers alike. That safety in numbers advantage doesn't disappear because Lenovo sells a cheaper Linux ThinkPad or because HP ran an internal trial. But it does erode, gradually and measurably, every time a major manufacturer makes it easier and more financially obvious to seriously consider something else, and every time doing so stops requiring specialized technical knowledge most buyers simply don't have. Microsoft doesn't need to fear a sudden, dramatic desktop revolution happening in 2026 or 2027. What it genuinely does need to watch closely is exactly what's already visible in this year's numbers. A slow, compounding change in default instinct, where checking the Linux option on a Lenovo configuration page stops feeling like a niche decision reserved for hobbyists, and starts feeling like an entirely ordinary, financially sensible one for millions of everyday buyers and business IT departments alike. That's the real story, hiding underneath a headline about the world's biggest PC companies supposedly ditching Windows. They haven't ditched it, not even close, not by 2026's numbers. But for the first time in decades, they're building real, visible, price-competitive alternatives right next to it, on the same product pages, using the same trusted hardware, and that alone represents a genuine crack in an assumption the entire PC industry treated as permanent for 30 straight years. So here's the real question worth sitting with, as this trend keeps building through the rest of 2026. If your next laptop offered you the exact same hardware for $140 less, just running Linux instead of Windows, would you actually take that deal? Let me know your honest answer in the comments, and if you want to keep following exactly how this plays out across the rest of the year, subscribe, because this is nowhere near finished. I'll see you in the next one.